Prop 314, which is on its way to passage by a significant margin, allows state and local law enforcement to arrest and detain those suspected of crossing the U.S. border into Arizona without authorization. It also would make it a state crime for people living in the U.S. without documentation to apply for public benefits. To discuss the impact of Prop 314 passing, we welcome Delia Salvatierra, an attorney from the Salvatierra Law Group. Good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you.
What does Prop 314 call for?
Mayhem.
That's your one-word response, isn't it?
It is. It's mayhem.
Why?
Because it creates an avenue for the legislature to create new avenues of criminal conduct that belong with the federal authorities. Immigration is protected under the Constitution and delegated to the federal government. It is not delegated to the states, because not all the states should have different varying definitions of who should be allowed into the country. This issue of criminalizing someone who's in the country or who has entered the country illegally and not at a port of entry, those are definitions defined by federal law. The way that a county or a sheriff is going to interpret it is going to create absolute mayhem.
It calls for crossing the border into Arizona without authorization. What kind of authorization is needed?
Authorization, very interestingly, the statute says that someone who's been permitted to enter on parole by Customs and Border Protection is not deemed to have entered the country lawfully. This is turning the definition of entry into the United States under federal authority on its head.
What happens now to those who enter without authorization, and how does that change?
We don't know. I think that's why it's absolute mayhem, because I don't think that there was any forethought by those who addressed this piece of legislation and created it, and what they would do to Arizona courts, Arizona law enforcement, and they're going to be able to, they don't even have access to federal databases of who is legal or undocumented in this country. How are they going to access that information to begin with?
So again, local law enforcement, state and local law enforcement can arrest and detain, and state judges can deport. I mean, again, without what you're saying is...
How? I mean, the statute might say, you know, what it wants to accomplish, but it doesn't say how it's going to accomplish it. And it's the how that got Arizona in deep waters in Arizona versus United States in SB 1070. And that's why it was struck down, because it simply did not have the authority to do what it said it was going to do.
What happens when local law enforcement right now, I mean, it's kind of it's conjecture, and it's a hypothetical that's kind of difficult to put your arms around. But right now, what would happen to someone who does not have the proper authorization and is contacted or has an encounter with local law enforcement? What happens?
That depends on the officer, right, to some extent. If they don't have identification, then they can arrest them for not having identification. And once they're inside, let's say, 4th Avenue under Maricopa County Jail, then ICE comes in and determines their nationality. And then if they're undocumented, ICE makes a decision whether they should be transferred over to DHS custody or not for removal proceedings to deport them. If the individual has insurance, if the individual is carrying registration and their documents are in order to drive, then they should be treated like anybody else. You know, they're licensed to drive, they have, you know, insurance, etc. A state officer is not authorized to determine the immigration status of a non-citizen.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. If the officer, law enforcement officer, sees them visually crossing the border and approaches them and finds out that they don't have authorization, it sounds like it's covered in this law.
Yes.
But what if you don't see that? You have stopped someone for rolling through a stop sign or something like that. Right. How do you know that they have crossed the border into the U.S. without the proper authorization?
They don't. They don't. And that is the mayhem of this statute. You know, they still have to have probable cause in order to stop them, consistent with the Constitution. But I think that during the Arpaio years, and the reason that SB 1070 was overturned was because we were able to determine that people weren't following the law. Officers given more authority than they could handle. A law enforcement officer can't determine how someone came into the country. It's not possible.
This 314 also requires E-Verify as far as public benefits are concerned. What is E-Verify, and how does that change from the situation now?
So what the statute calls for is that individuals must not present false documents to secure employment and must pass E-Verify. So public benefits is separate from the provision of providing false documents to work. Now the responsibility and criminal liability is going to be on the individual who presents false documents to an employer. They will be subject to a Class 1 misdemeanor. For public benefits, the statute says that it's a felony if you request public benefits using false documents.
Interesting. Last point here. Everything we've talked about could be completely moot if Texas, the law in Texas, this is kind of mirrored after that Texas law, if the courts say, nah, that doesn't cut it. So where does that Texas law stand, and where do we stand in Arizona with that Texas law?
I think that's one of the most ironic things, that Arizona would allow what happens in another state dictate what happens in Arizona. I have never seen that. And this law is not to go into effect until 60 days have passed after the federal district court has given Texas the green light on SB 4, which Prop 314 mirrors. However, I think what will happen is that the Biden administration is the one who sued Texas to not enforce that law. Once there's a change in administration and the Trump administration takes over, they will withdraw their lawsuit, the Department of Justice lawsuit against Texas, and that will have the green light to move forward if they don't prosecute.
In 60 days, it's a done deal here in Arizona then?
60 days after the passage in Texas.
In Texas, yeah.
Correct.
All right, Delia Salvatierra, lots of information here, mayhem, confusion. I think a lot of people aren't quite, they think they know what it's about, but as far as the details are kind of, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.